you going back like 5 minutes basically to what you mentioned was the term like, oh, women are happier in the home with a husband and kids, right? And so the term of ignorance is bliss, I think for a lot of women who do not have the opportunity to get an education and they are forced to be in the home, they don't know any other alternative. So some women are truly happy, but if that becomes the standard that women have to be in the home and have kids and they don't have the opportunity to get an education, then of course that's going to be something that they think brings them joy because they don't have any other opportunities. And so like there's a lot of people in my mom's generation or my grandma's generation where like they were like, man, I wish I could have gone to school and like had an education and like picked someone, and they just fell into a marriage that either was abusive or like they weren't happy. And so I think that it's easier to report higher levels of happiness when you perceive it to be your only option is living in the home and having children and raising them. Yeah. So, but what do you have to say to that? Because I'm curious,
interestingly,
because it goes to your like underreported things like you were talking about earlier.
Well, first of all, when you give anecdotal evidence like, oh, my mom and mom's friends.
Oh, I can give you an actual study if you want.
May have, and I can refute it. I promise. But here's the thing: when you give anecdotal evidence and you say, well, my mom's friends, this and that, wish that they could have gone to school. There's also anecdotal evidence, and an awful lot of it, and you can find it on YouTube right now, of tons of women saying they wish that they had not gone and gotten a career, and wish that they would have instead deferred those childbearing years in order to have a family, because they see the happiness levels of their friends, colleagues, co-workers, things like this. That anecdotally is also just as true. But to even go on to the ignorance is bliss, I could say this and make this case about literally anything. I could say, well, I would love heroin, right? I've never taken it, but ignorance is bliss, right? Oh, I could say ignorance is bliss about literally anything, any drug,
well, that's not the only
hang on, any
though.
risky, I didn't cut you off, any risky behavior, any of this. I could say that about anything. What you're doing is saying, these women are happy. There must be some bad reason for that.
Oh no, some women are happy.
No, you're saying,
I agree.
These women are happy and there must be a bad reason for that, and the bad, because they're doing traditional, because they're doing traditional gender roles. So that must be bad. So we can explain that away by saying, if they had all these negative experiences, that those women who have those negative experiences actually report a higher unhappiness level, those women would actually be happier. That's absurd logic, by the way.
Okay, sure. Well, again, I agreed with you on quite a few things there, but I would also like to say that, like I said at the beginning in my opening statement, the home being the most dangerous place for women, like there are women who are in abusive marriages, and so they have to convince themselves that they are happy because their husband is beating them or like assaulting them or harming their children. And when you're in that sort of situation, it's very difficult to be able to walk away from it, and oftentimes because you're isolated. And so, yeah, because the home is the most dangerous place for women, and 6 women are killed every hour in the home around the world. Those are very difficult realities that a lot of people don't want to grasp. And I'm not saying that every woman doesn't, isn't happy in the home. I think there are plenty of happy moms. I mean, my mom has worked and raised our children, her children, and my sisters and I, and like helped my dad out with like work. But yeah, for the most part, was a stay-at-home mom, and I think she really enjoyed it. But for me, at this point in my life, that's not something that I would like. And it's not to say that it's a bad thing, but I think that some people are convincing themselves that they're happy when in reality it's a very difficult situation.
I'm going to have to go back to the NIS where I point out to you that as you keep saying that the most dangerous situation for women is in the home.
Well, that's according to the UN around the world, though, not just here.
Okay, but inside of the United States at least, and inside of the Western nations, this is a commonality that they all share. It's not usually from the husband. It's usually from boyfriends of single women or single moms, or as far as, for instance, cohabitation. Cohabitation leads to some of the worst outcomes for women when they're not married, and men. It leads to terrible outcomes for both. This idea that you have that when you say this, it's very loaded. It gives the impression that husbands are at home abusing their wives, and the opposite is actually true. The truth is that when women get divorced and they end up in these occupied relationships, that's when they end up with the most amount of abuse, not from their husbands.
Well, I think it's, how we were talking about earlier about like confounding factors and other things that might, the classification of things might change the results of studies. For this one, I'm looking at it, and it says facts and statistics on domestic violence DV, and it's mainly including intimate partner. So it's not talking about husband or boyfriend.
That's why we separate them, right? So we would separate those two categories to see who's the more abusive.
Do you have a statistic?
Yes, I just gave it to you twice from the NIS.
But I know, but like I'm looking at it, and again, like I'm having.
Show me the numbers from the NIS that you're looking at. I actually don't believe you.
Oh, I'm not looking at the NIS right now. I was looking at it earlier, could not find the number you were talking about.
Yeah, but you looked at it for 1 minute.
No, I didn't.
You did. I literally pulled it direct from the NIS itself.
When there is a minor in the home and there is abuse, they look at both parents. And in that case, they are finding, according to this, the Domestic Violence Center data for Mankind Initiative, I'm finding...
The Mankind Initiative?
Yeah, here,
the
I'll
cult?
send it to you.
The cult, the Mankind Initiative?
I have no idea what you're talking. I mean, this is like it's a statistic, like it's like a study that's produced.
Yeah,
or I could go to the University of Pennsylvania's one
do
if you
that
want.
because the
Okay.
Mankind Initiative, as far as I know, is a Western cult which exists as a demasculating agency. Just so you know.
Okay. Well, so it's saying analyzing 31,000. This is Penn today. So this does go to your point. It is just slightly above the spouse rate for abusive boyfriends. But again,
And those go reported much more, right? The marriage rates go reported much more than than these rates where you're living outside of the home with another man.
right. So
Because that's the more common living arrangement. Therefore, I am correct. It is true that the most dangerous situation is co-occupancy, not marriage.
I mean, there's different. I think it's difficult. You deal a lot in absolutes, and as a teacher, that's something that we are told not to do to facilitate like open communication. Is because you typically say, "Well, this is true. This is true. That means I am truth. I am correct in saying this thing." But again, statistics are changing all the time. So actually, you're contradicting yourself
No, I'm
because
not
at the
doing
beginning
that.
you were like,
What I'm saying is
things
that
change.
I can negate these with logic by simply pointing this out.
I mean, you can negate
That if it is
anything
the
when you talk
case-
to yourself like you do because you're not really listening to the words that are coming out of my mouth.
I'm listening
but-
to. Do you want me to steelman your position? You just said to me that everything when it comes to statistics is fluid. I would tend to agree with that based on
Okay.
oncoming data which is coming
Right.
in. However, we still have to apply logic and inductive reasoning even when we're dealing with data sets, especially.
I didn't say we don't. I
Yeah.
agree.
So those are unchanging, unconfounding variables, logic and reason. So if we're using those two things, we can easily point to this and say, we know for sure that it's going to be underreported in cohabitation and possibly reported at least better from the marriage standpoint. That's probably true. I don't think
Yeah.
anybody would really dispute that.
Yeah, actually, I found a study to your point. Researchers have consistently found higher rates of violence in cohabitating compared to marital relationships. But in those cases, still, it is 95% of perpetrators are male. So what do you have to say in terms of that?
Yeah, okay, so here's what happens. What feminism has done, especially with the destruction of the marriage, is it has put women in the most vulnerable position, where now they leave their home with their husband, where the abuse rates are not nearly so high as pretentious feminists pretend they are, so that they can cohabitate with men, with other men who are strangers to them, strangers to their children. It puts their children at risk, and it puts them at actually higher risk than if they had stayed with their husbands in most cases.
Oh, okay. That makes sense as an explanation, but I think that, again, that's an anecdote that's probably not true for everybody. And the cases are pretty clearly in place. Like the evidence has shown that regardless of whether there's children in the marriage, 95% of the perpetrators are men. And, we were talking about how it is likely underreported for female perpetrators, right, in marriages. I'm sure there are abusive wives, but I think that the point being is that it is it is definitely a pattern in terms of, in the United States, of the home being made unsafe because of men that live there. It doesn't have to be the husband, but it is men that are, being violent with the women that they are living with. And I think your point about how it's women that are picking these boyfriends that are abusing them is not fair, because again, you don't know men that are going to turn out to be abusive until they hit you one day. It doesn't start out with, if you went on a first date with a woman and she clocked you in the face, would you continue to date her? No, you wouldn't. It's the same with women.
Here's what we're going to do.
Okay,
Andrew, you give your response, then we're going to do prompt change.
Okay.
Okay, so just
But yeah,
so
that
you
was the end
know,
of my
I don't
statement.
even understand this. Like, all of the stats back up exactly what I'm saying. You agree with me that what I'm saying is likely the most true case scenario, at least compared to all the
About
numbers.
boyfriends being more abusive?
Yeah, can I finish? Right?
Oh, I was just
I didn't
clarifying.
cut you off. So the thing is like, look, as we look at this data, the data backs up everything that I just said, especially when it comes to cohabitation. You say, well, it's not women's responsibility that they're picking these men. It's like, well, women are initiating most of these divorces. For one, they're leaving their husbands. They put themselves in this confounding situation where now they're being abused by strange men, often because they want them as sexual partners or other things like this. You say, well, that's true that the abuse happens inside of these places, male, whether there's children or not. Great. But when it's a cohabitation event where children are involved, you're now putting your children at risk because the risk skyrockets for abuse. skyrockets for abuse of those children. No wonder men don't want to get married to modern women if they're going to get divorced, and their women are going to put their children in an abusive situation, right? And that's what the stats show more than anything. Not that women are being abused, but that when they have authority over children, they are putting them in situations where they are abused or abusing them themselves. That's what's actually happening.
We do have to change prompts. Andrew, I think you wanted to perhaps discuss patriarchy and force doctrine.
Sure.
Would you like to get into that? Go ahead.
Yeah, you can start.
Yeah, so I'll give you my definition of patriarchy first. It's a historic definition. It means rule of the father. I often will short phrase this to from the father. Usually it operates around something which is patrilineal lineage rather than matrilineal lineage, though not always. You can have patriarchies where there's matrilineal lineage. You can find this in Judaism and other places like this. When I talk about patriarchy, I'm broadly speaking, at least in modernity and in the last 100 years, about men being in charge of general systems. We could just say men being in charge of general systems, head of the household, head of the family, things like this. My view is that patriarchy is always going to end up being the default, especially the more feminism there is. You'll push more